Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Today's episode is going to be a special one though, where we exclude the cost of the commander. With just a $25 budget, it's pretty much impossible to build around some commanders unless we do so. Sometimes you get lucky and open up a commander in a pack, or you could just trade for them if you really want to build around them. So our budget is still going to be $25, but again, that's $25 for just 99 cards because we're excluding the cost of that commander. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCG Player. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new Golden Pig playmat on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased one, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's commander is Arixmethes Slumbering Isle. Arixmethes is a 12/12 Kraken that costs 2 green-blue. It enters the battlefield tapped with 5 slumber counters on it, and as long as it has one of those counters on it, it's a land. Whenever you cast a spell, you can remove one of those slumber counters from it, and it can tap for green-blue. Arixmethes is an extremely unique commander. It's basically a creature that starts off as a land. And since it starts in your command zone, it's always a guaranteed form of ramp. As you're casting spells, you can choose to either keep those slumber counters on or remove them, depending on the situation. If you decide to remove that last counter, then Arixmethes becomes a huge threat as a 12/12 Kraken. And with the right build around, Kraken can actually be a relevant creature type. So what's our strategy for this deck? Well, we want to ramp as quickly as possible to start casting sea monsters. Again, Arixmethes is a guaranteed form of ramp from our command zone. We're going to be running a ton of spells that can ramp us on turn 2 so that we can cast Arixmethes as early as turn 3. So if we hit all of our land drops, by turn 4 we're going to have 7 mana. And then how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to overwhelm our opponents with our sea monsters, or we can combo off. With how quickly we can reliably ramp with this deck, we're going to be getting out a ton of sea monsters very fast. And if that doesn't work, we've got a few tricks up our sleeves to finish off our opponents. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's go on to tactic number 1, Rock and Roller. Again, we want to make sure that we can consistently get Arixmethes out on turn 3, so we need to make sure that we can ramp by turn 2. So we're going to be running things like Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. And then we've got Farseek, which will search our library for an island and put into play tapped. Rampant Growth will let us either go get an island or a forest and put into play tapped. And Edge of Autumn will do the exact same thing, but only if we control 4 or fewer lands. And we can even cycle it later on in the game by sacrificing a land. And then there's Prismatic Lens, which can either tap for a colorless or we can use it to filter our mana. Next up is Sphere of the Suns, which can tap for 1 mana of any color, but we can only do it 3 times. And then Star Compass can tap for either of our colors, depending on our land situation. And next we have Simic Signet, which we can pay 1 into to tap for green-blue. Then we've got some creatures that can help us with ramping and fixing. Quirion Elves, Drover the Mighty, and Beastcaller Savant can tap for either of our colors. Beastcaller Savant is restricted though, in that its mana can only be used to cast creature spells. To make up for that though, it does have the added benefit of haste. Next up are a few creatures that can easily tap for 2 in this deck. First up is Whisper of the Wilds, which taps for a green, but if we have Ferocious, it taps for a green-green. And finally, we've got Voyaging Satyr and Kyora's Follower, both can untap our commander. So if we can get either of them out on turn 2, by turn 3 we're getting our commander out, and on turn 4, if we hit all of our land drops, we'll have 8 mana. Again, with this deck, it is easy for us to ramp quickly because of that guaranteed ramp in our command zone. Now, there are plenty of creatures that we can cast with all of that mana, but why do we choose the specific ones that we did? Let's go through some of those reasons why in tactic number 2, a Sea of Monsters. First up is Quest for Ula's Temple, which is an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep you may look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, you may reveal it and put a quest counter on Quest for Ula's Temple. And then at the beginning of each end step, if there are 3 or more quest counters on it, you may put a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. We're running plenty of creatures in this deck, so it won't take too long for us to get 3 quest counters on this card. And then once we do, we get a ton of value out of this card. Speaking of value, we're also going to be running Whelming Wave and Slin Voda the Rising Deep, which are basically just one-sided board wipes for this deck. Whelming Wave says return all creatures to their owner's hands except for Krakens, Leviathans, Octopuses, and Serpents. And then Slin Voda does the exact same thing if we kick it, but it also includes Merfolk. These cards can easily swing the game into our favor and even win us the game in the right situation. And finally there's Displacement Wave, which is going to return all non-land permanents with converted mana cost X or less to their owner's hand. Again, this can easily be a one-sided board wipe because the vast majority of our creatures have a very high converted mana cost. So what are some of those big creatures that we're going to be playing? Let's go through the first of our types in tactic number 3, Unleash the Kraken. First up there's Tromokratis, which is a huge beater for us. It's hard for our opponents to deal with because it has hexproof unless it's attacking or blocking, and it's hard for our opponents to block because they have to actually use all of their creatures to block it. Next up, we've got some more creatures that are tough for our opponents to deal with. Storm Surge Kraken starts off as just a 5/5 with hexproof, but as long as we control our commander, it's going to be a 7/7 that whenever it's blocked, we draw 2 cards. And then Isleback Spawn is a 4/8 with Shroud, but can get even bigger if someone's library is running low. And then we've got a couple of creatures that can easily get through our opponent's lines of defense. Kraken of the Straits can't be blocked by creatures with power less than the number of islands that we control. And then Tidal Kraken and Deep Sea Kraken are just straight up unblockable. And next up is Shipbreaker Kraken, which when it becomes monstrous, we tap up to 4 target creatures, and then those creatures can't untap as long as we control it. This card is great at dismantling some of our opponent's threats and also being a big threat in itself. And finally, there's Scourge of Fleets, which can be another one-sided board wipe in the right situation. When it enters the battlefield, we get to return each creature that our opponents control with toughness X or less to its owner's hand, where X is the number of islands that we control. So early on in the game, this might not get very many creatures, but later on in the game, this can be a back-breaking card. So we've gone through all of our Krakens, and now it's time to move on to our next creature type. Let's go through them now in tactic number 4, Lethal Leviathans. First up, we've got 2 flying threats with Nimbus Swimmer and Simic Sky Swallower. We can put a ton of mana into Nimbus Swimmer to make it a huge threat, and then Simic Sky Swallower is very hard for our opponents to deal with because not only does it have Trample, but it also has Shroud. Next up is Pearl Lake Ancient, which can be another threat that's hard for our opponents to deal with. It has Flash, it can't be countered, and we can even return it back to our hand. On top of all that, it even has Prowess, so it's going to grow whenever we cast a non-creature spell. And then there's Trench Gorger, which can also grow into a huge beast. Not only does it have Trample, but when it enters the battlefield, we can search our library for any number of land cards and then exile them and then shuffle our library. If we do, Trench Gorger's power and toughness each become equal to the number of cards we exiled this way. So Trench Gorger can easily become our biggest threat, and it also can clear out our library of any dead land draws later on in the game. Next up, we've got a couple of big threats that can be unblockable in the right situation. Inkwell Leviathan is a huge threat, being a 7/11 with Trample, Island Walk, and Shroud. And then Stormtide Leviathan is a huge threat that can even prevent some opponents' decks from attacking. It has creatures without flying or Island Walk can attack. And not only does it have Island Walk, but it also says all lands are islands in addition to their other types. With this card, we need to be careful though, because there are times that we aren't going to want to play it. There are other times though where this is a very effective card because there are plenty of creatures in this deck that have either flying or Island Walk. Next up is Breaching Leviathan, which when it enters the battlefield, if we cast it from our hand, we get to tap all non-blue creatures, and then those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. Every single one of our threats in this deck is a blue creature, so it's not going to affect any of them. This card can easily win us the game by shutting down our opponent's creatures for multiple turns while allowing us to swing through. And then there's Aether Squall Ancient, which is going to get us 3 energy during our upkeep. And then it allows us to pay 8 energy to return all other creatures to their owner's hands. But finally, there's Cataract Leviathan, which has an even bigger effect. When it enters the battlefield, we're going to return all other non-land permanents to their owner's hands. On top of that, it even has Unearth, so we can get this effect again. Alright, so now we've gone through our Krakens and Leviathans. What creature type is next? Let's go through those creatures now in tactic number 5, Odd Octopuses. First up, there's Elder Deep Fiend, which when we cast it, we're going to tap up to 4 target permanents. But also it does have Flash and Emerge, so we do have some flexibility on when and how we cast it. And next up is Lorthos the Tidemaker, which can straight up end games on its own. It's an 8/8, and whenever it attacks, we can pay 8 mana. If we do, we get to tap up to 8 target permanents, and then those permanents don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. This can be especially effective late game if we're just down to a 1-on-1 where we can just tap down our opponent's lands. And since we finished up Octopuses, there's only one type of sea monster left. Let's go through that creature type now in tactic number 6, Slippery Serpents. First up, there's Striped Riverwinder, which is just a 5/5 with hexproof, but we can cycle it for a blue. And then there's Benthic Behemoth, which does have Island Walk, which comes in handy most of the time. Next up is Gearseeker Serpent, which we can make unblockable for 5 and a blue if we need to get some damage through. And then the vast majority of commander decks run artifacts, so Scrapdiver Serpent is going to be unblockable most of the time. And finally, we've got Changeling Titan, which is a changeling, so it's every single creature type at all times. So basically, for the purposes of this deck, we're going to consider it to be a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, Serpent. And it has Champion a Creature, so when it comes into play, we have to sacrifice it unless we remove another creature we control from the game, and then when it leaves play, that card returns to play. This can even be an upside for us because we do have creatures that have some pretty great enter the battlefield effects. Now, these sea monsters are great, but how do we make sure that we get to them? Let's go through that now in tactic number 7, Gone Fishing. First up is Fierce Empath, which is just straight up going to go find us one of those creatures. When it enters the battlefield, we can search our library for a creature card with converted mana cost 6 or greater and just put it into our hand. And nearly every single one of our sea monsters falls into that category. And then we've got Soul's Majesty and Rush of Knowledge, both of which can draw us a ton of cards. Soul's Majesty is going to draw us cards equal to the power of target creature that we control. And then Rush of Knowledge is going to draw us cards equal to the highest converted mana cost among permanents that we control. We have plenty of cards in this deck that have a lot of power and a huge converted mana cost, so we're going to be drawing a ton of cards with either of these. Next up, we've got some spells that can draw us cards over time. First up is Colossal Majesty, which is an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. And then Tatyova Benthic Druid is just a great value engine for any Simic deck. It has whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Next up, we've got Mouth to Feed, and the mouth half is going to create a 3/3 green hippo creature token. But the more important part of this is Feed, and it's going to let us draw a card for each creature that we control with power 3 or greater. And then there's Shamanic Revelation, which is just going to straight up draw us a card for each creature that we control. On top of that, it's going to gain us 4 life for each creature that we control with power 4 or greater. So once we're set up, this is going to gain us a ton of life and draw us a ton of cards all at once. Next up is Frantic Search, which will draw us 2 cards, but then we discard 2 cards, and we can untap up to 3 lands. So if we have Arixmethes in play as a land, this basically nets us 1 mana since it taps for 2. And finally, we've got Stroke of Genius and Blue Sun Zenith, both of which can either draw us a ton of cards or even win us the game. There are certain ways for us to generate infinite mana with this deck and mill someone out with these cards. But even if we aren't set up to do that, we can produce a ton of mana with this deck, and these cards are invaluable for drawing us cards. So we've talked a lot about our plan, but what about throwing a wrench into our opponents? Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 8, back to basics. First up is Broken Bond, which can destroy target artifact or enchantment, and then we can put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield. This is a very flexible card that can even help us ramp into our commander in the right situation. And then there's Reclamation Sage, which is going to destroy an artifact or enchantment when it enters the battlefield. And we're running plenty of spells in this deck that can bounce creatures, so we can get this effect more than once. But what about some more direct ways to deal with spells that are going to be problematic for us? Let's go through those ways in tactic number 9, Stop That. First up is Negate, which is going to counter target non-creature spell. For the most part, we have creatures under control because we're going to have the biggest threats on the board. So we're also going to be running Unwind, which counters a non-creature spell, and it untaps 3 of our lands. Rewind is very similar. It's going to counter target spell, but it's going to untap 4 of our lands. Both of these spells can actually net us mana because, again, our commander taps for 2. So with all these great cards, though, how do we actually finish off our opponents? Let's go through that now in tactic number 10, End of the World. First up, we've got Biden of Thassa, which serves a dual purpose in this deck. It has whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. And then you can pay 1 and a blue to tap it to make creatures your opponents control attack this turn if able. So not only can this draw us a ton of cards, but it can also force our opponents to attack. By doing that, we can force them to swing out when they don't want to into our giant army. And then they're going to be wide open, so we can swing right back at them to finish them off. And next up, there's Archetype of Imagination, which basically is going to make all of our creatures unblockable. It has creatures you control have flying, and creatures your opponents control lose flying and can't have or gain flying. So unless our opponent's creatures have reach, they're not going to be able to block our creatures with this in play. And then there's Goreclaw, Terror of Kalsisma, which does double duty for this deck. It's going to make our creature spells with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. And then whenever it attacks, each creature that we control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until the end of the turn. So not only is she going to help us cast our creatures quicker, she's also going to help us trample over our opponent's defenses. Speaking of trampling over, we're going to be running Overwhelming Stampede and Dragon Throne of Tarkir. Overwhelming Stampede says, until the end of the turn, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. And then Dragon Throne of Tarkir basically does the exact same thing, but it's a repeatable effect on an equipment. Now, we don't always want our commander to be a creature, but when it is, these cards are especially effective with it. And then another time that we want our commander to be a creature is when we have Freed from the Real. Freed from the Real is an aura that we can either pay a blue to tap enchanted creature or a blue to untap enchanted creature. This is one of the ways that we discussed earlier to get infinite mana. By attaching this to our commander, we can just tap it for green and a blue and then use that blue mana to untap it. We can do this over and over again, generating infinite amounts of green mana. And again, if we have this in combination with something like Stroke of Genius, we can actually just mill someone out right away. Now, this card is great, but it's not game ending on its own. It requires us to have other pieces to take advantage of that infinite mana. But our Golden Pig of the deck is game ending on its own. A quick reminder that the Golden Pig is the #1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Pemin's Aura. Pemin's Aura is an aura that costs 1 blue. It has blue untap enchanted creature. Blue enchanted creature gains flying until the end of the turn. Blue enchanted creature gains shroud until the end of the turn. In 1 generic mana, enchanted creature gets +1/-1 or -1/+1 until the end of the turn. Pemin's Aura has the exact same untap ability as Freed from the Real does. So in combination with our commander, it can instantly go infinite. But on top of that, it can protect our commander too by giving it Shroud until the end of the turn. But where it can win us the game is with its other 2 abilities. We can give it flying for a blue so that it can get through most defenses. And then after we make infinite green mana, we can activate that last ability as many times as we want. Most of the time, we're going to turn into a 21/3 that can kill any opponent that can't block it in 1 shot. So not only does this card help us generate infinite mana, but it helps us use that mana to win. And that's what makes it the Golden Pig. This deck is a ton of fun and can ramp really quickly to get out absurdly big creatures. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. First up, there's Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. And then there's Bant Panorama, which we can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice to search for either a basic forest or island and put into play tapped. Next up is Warp Landscape, which can tap for a colorless, or we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. And then we've got Simic Guildgate, Woodland Stream, and Thornwood Falls, each of which enters the battlefield tapped. It can either tap for a green or a blue. On top of that, when Thornwood Falls comes into play, we gain 1 life. Next up is Simic Growth Chamber, which enters the battlefield tapped, and we're going to have to return a land back to our hand when it does. But it does have the upside of tapping for green-blue. And then there's Mosswork Bridge, which is a hideaway land, so when it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped, and when it does, we get to look at the top 4 cards of our library, exile one of them face down, and then put the rest on the bottom of our library. We can then either tap it for a green, or we can pay a green and tap it to play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if creatures we control have a total power of 10 or greater. Next up is Rogue's Passage, which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 4 and tap it to make target creature unblockable until the end of the turn. Finally, we're going to be running 25 basic lands, 13 of those are going to be islands, and 12 will be a forest. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCG player optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Arixmethes EDH rec deck is going to set you back $141.26, so let's see how we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at just $24.97. A quick reminder that neither of these deck costs include the Commander because it's a Commander excluded episode. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned in focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. First up is Grozoth, which comes in at $1.93. Grozoth is a 9/9 Leviathan for 6 blue. It has Defender, and when it comes into play, you may search your library for any number of cards that have converted mana cost 9, reveal them, and put them into your hand. If you do, shuffle your library. You can pay 4 to make Grozoth lose Defender until the end of the turn. And you can also transmute it for 1 blue. Grozoth is just a big threat that can really help us go get some of our other big threats. And then there's Spearbreaker Behemoth, which comes in at $2.32. It's a 5/5 indestructible beast that costs 5 green. It has pay 1, target creature with power 5 or greater is indestructible this turn. This is a great way to give some of our biggest threats indestructible and to protect them. Next up is Traverse the Outlands, which comes in at $7.91. It's a sorcery that costs 4 and a green, and it says, search your library for up to X basic land cards where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. We are running a ton of giant creatures in this deck, and we can get a lot of lands off of this card. And then there's Rishkar's Expertise, which comes in at $3.88. Rishkar's Expertise is a sorcery that costs 4 green. It says, draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. You may cast a card with converted mana cost 5 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. This card is a lot like Soul's Majesty, but it's even better because it doesn't target our creature and it lets us cast a card for free. Next up is Prime Speaker Zagana, which comes in at $3.25. It's a 1/1 Merfolk Wizard that costs 2 green, blue. It has Prime Speaker Zagana enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the greatest power among other creatures you control. When Prime Speaker Zagana enters the battlefield, draw cards equal to its power. Again, this is a great way to draw a ton of cards without having to target one of our creatures. And finally, there's Elemental Bond, which comes in at $1.92. Elemental Bond is an enchantment that costs 2 and a green, and it says, whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This is a fantastic way to helping us keep our engine going and giving us some additional value off of those giant creatures that we're casting. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you use that decklist link in the description below. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCG Player, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, and then check out some of our playlists on budget commander decks, commander excluded decks, and break the bank episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.